LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to the January 12th edition of LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. Give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you like what I'm doing here. I picked out the weekend's dozen best, most newsworthy clips from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States, for which should be a really informative, fair use media criticism and political commentary show for you all tonight. If you want to follow along with my notes on my clip list, I put a link down in the video description to my clip list of my 12 clips, if you can understand my notes to myself. Impeachment, again, is actually not the main topic I'm covering this week, which may have been the purpose of that strike in Baghdad as we discussed last week, though I will have a few clips on impeachment, both a Nancy Pelosi clip at the beginning and then one at the end paired with a clip of Senator Chris Coons talking about the Senate impeachment trial that may start as early as this week. But the main topic will be Iran again, where questions remain about the intelligence justifying the Trump administration strike in Iraq against Qassem Soleimani, a top Iranian general, and you will see a clip of Trump NSA National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien and a few clips of his Trump Secretary of Defense Mark Esper trying to back up Trump's possibly made-up claim on Fox News this week that 4 embassies were under imminent threat from this Iranian general. But to start, since there's no real political comedy this week, I'm going to use the low humor of Trump insults and Nancy Pelosi's "I'm rubber, you're glue" defense to them this morning on This Week with George Stephanopoulos. And I will show you that clip where George Stephanopoulos confronts Nancy Pelosi with these insults and gets that "I'm rubber, you're glue" defense. And talk about it with you after we watch that clip together over here.
We don't. That is a cover-up.
You know, just before we came on the air, President Trump, literally 30 seconds before we came on the air, President Trump sent out a tweet to me asking me to ask you a question. We're going to put it up on the screen right now. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but as you see there, right there, he calls you crazy Nancy, again, wants you to justify Adam Schiff's comments during the House hearings, and he says your hearings were unfair and biased. And this builds on what he did on Friday night. I want to show him on Friday night on Fox News.
She is obsessed with impeachment. She has done nothing. She's going to go down as one of the worst speakers in the history of our country.
Let me just say, it's Sunday morning. I'd like to talk about some more pleasant subjects than the erratic nature of this president of the United States. But he has to know that every knock from him is a boost. He's the president who said, I should have impeached George Bush because of the war in Iraq, and now he's saying, I'm obsessed. I held off on this because, frankly, I said, Donald Trump is not worth impeachment.
You did say that.
He's not worth it. But when he crossed that line on Ukraine, he violated the Constitution in such a way that could not be ignored.
And you
so, again, I don't like to spend too much time on his crazy tweets because everything he says is a projection. When he calls somebody crazy, he knows that he is. Everything he says, you can just translate it back to who he is. But again, it's Sunday morning. Let's be optimistic about the future, a future that will not have Donald Trump in the White House. One way or another, 10 months from now, we will have an election if we don't have him removed sooner. But again, he will be impeached forever.
But I want to talk about Iran as well. I'm not sure it's a more pleasant subject, but I do want to talk about that.
Well, no, it's not unpleasant to talk about the Constitution of the United States. This is what we take an oath to protect and defend. This is what this president has violated again and again. This is a president who has said, Article 2 says, I can do whatever I want. It does not. This is a constitution that Benjamin Franklin said is a republic if we can keep it, not a monarchy. And Article 2 says, but I can do whatever I want, makes it a monarchy. So this is in defiance of the valor of our founders and what they established, and just loyal to his oath of office. And so as I say, every knock from him is a boost, and everything he says about somebody else is a projection.
You said he's violating
weakness.
the Constitution again and again. Do you think it's possible that the House might have to file new articles of impeachment?
And you can actually see the answer to that question if you want to follow the link down in the video description to the full source of my clip there, ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. I'm not going to show that answer, though. Later, when I get to the couple clips at the end about impeachment, I will show Nancy Pelosi talking about her plans to send the articles of impeachment over to the Senate after the House votes on it sometime this week, I think Tuesday or Wednesday. And I will talk about that when we get to those final two clips. But before that, I want to get to 3 news summaries and 6 newsmaker clips on Iran. There's a little bit of on impeachment in there, and actually you'll see the first news summary and the longest and, as usual, best news summary comes from NBC News' Meet the Press, narrated by Chuck Todd, where he does his live introduction where he talks about the 3 I's, Iran, impeachment, and Iowa, because actually Iowa's coming up in just a few weeks, the first, well, it's not a primary, but the Democratic caucus. It's going to be a little different this year. One of the things I learned listening to all the commentary on the morning shows is that they're going to tell you not only who gets the most delegates at the end of the Iowa caucuses, because you have to get at least 15% of the, it's not a vote. People don't vote for the Iowa caucuses. It's not like a regular voting thing. You have to show up at the caucus and split into groups, and if your candidate doesn't have 15% of the caucus goers, then you have to choose another, your second choice or your third choice or whatever. But this year they're actually going to say how many people showed up for each candidate right at the beginning. That's going to be a new result from the Iowa caucuses. I don't know if that's going to make any difference in how the news covers it, but there's also going to be the final debate before the Iowa caucuses this Tuesday. I might have a chance to cover that, but I'll talk about that when I get to the final topic. Now I want to get to the first news summary. Chuck Todd talking about the 3 I's. Like I said, I'm not really covering Iowa except, I'm not covering Iowa, but I am covering Iran and impeachment. I might cover Iowa after the Democratic debate this Tuesday on CNN. But here's, like I said, Chuck Todd doing his news summary about the 3 I's, and he covers all 3 of the I's, and I will talk about them with you after we watch that 4.5 minute news summary from Chuck Todd this morning over here.
Good Sunday morning. Think of this as a 3-I morning: Iran, impeachment, and Iowa. On Iran, you can argue that President Trump's killing of Qassem Soleimani was either reckless or bold. But the administration now finds itself struggling to justify its evolving and contradictory explanations of whether Soleimani posed an imminent threat. At the same time, anti-government protests broke out in cities across Iran after officials there finally admitted that it was the Iranian military that shot down a Ukrainian passenger jet, killing 176 people. Next, there's impeachment. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi moved, finally, to send over articles of impeachment for a Senate trial that could begin as early as this week. That was a victory for Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who resisted Pelosi's delay tactics and refuses still to commit to allowing new witnesses or the introduction of new evidence. And on Iowa, a Des Moines Register poll released this weekend shows one more reshuffling at the top of the caucus race, now just 3 weeks away. Bernie Sanders has jumped to the lead for the first time in this poll, with Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, and Joe Biden all still within striking distance. No one else really that close. By the way, each of those top 4 candidates has now led the Des Moines Register's poll at least once at some point in the last year. And that gap between first and fourth, as you saw there, is well within the margin of error. Typically, Iowa would be our lead Sunday story 3 weeks before the caucuses. But this race has been overshadowed by events in Washington and overseas. After a 3-week delay and grumbling from some Democrats, Pelosi signaled she will send articles of impeachment to the Senate this week.
We are concerned that the senators will not be able to live up to the oath that they must take to have an impartial trial.
And she denied Democrats were divided over her delay.
Absolutely total cooperation.
There will be no haggling with the House over Senate procedure. We will not cede our authority to try this impeachment.
But several Republican senators are joining with Democrats, pressing McConnell to allow some witnesses to testify.
At this stage, I'd like to hear from John Bolton and other witnesses with direct information.
I am working with a group of Republican senators and our leaders to see if we can come to an agreement.
President Trump is promising to block Bolton's testimony, now tying impeachment to Iran tensions after the killing of Iranian General Soleimani.
We got to take this guy out. We're not going to have another shot at him maybe ever again. But I can't make it now because I'm trying to impeach Trump.
And highlighting new protests in Iran, praising its brave, long-suffering people after Iran's admission Saturday that human error brought down a Ukrainian plane while the country was on high alert for a possible American counterattack. That's after shifting explanations from the Trump administration to justify the Soleimani killing.
We did it because they were looking to blow up our embassy.
He was looking very seriously at our embassies and not just the embassy in Baghdad.
I can reveal that I believe it would have been 4 embassies.
That claim contradicts many of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's explanations.
There were a series of imminent attacks that were being plotted by Qassem Soleimani. We don't know precisely when, and we don't know precisely where. We had specific information on an imminent threat, and those threat stream included attacks on U.S. embassies. Period. Full stop.
You were mistaken when you said you didn't know precisely when and you didn't know precisely
nope,
where.
Completely true. Those are completely consistent thoughts.
But on Capitol Hill, where senators were briefed by top military and intelligence officials,
and not one word of that was mentioned.
Probably the worst briefing I've seen, at least on a military issue, in the 9 years I've served in the United States Senate.
And the president's Democratic opponents have been energized by the foreign policy contrast.
This is a moment that requires strong, steady, stable leadership.
President Trump's actions represent a dangerous escalation that brings us closer to yet another disastrous war in the Middle East.
And joining me now is the National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien.
And I'll have one clip of Robert O'Brien coming up, 3 clips of Mike Esper, the defense secretary, also coming up. A lot of cross-examination of this idea, especially Trump saying that there were these 4 embassies threatened by Qassem Soleimani, and that's why he was an imminent threat and had to be taken out. And I will be talking about that a little more later. But I thought it was interesting they decided to end there on Bernie Sanders, and you saw the poll results there. Well, I mean, there are like 4 people all within the margin of error in Iowa and New Hampshire. But Bernie Sanders does seem to be surging a little bit. He could be positioned to actually be the nominee. You know, I mentioned how I voted for him in the California primary back in 2016. I've been kind of leaning towards Elizabeth Warren, but her policy positions are very close to Bernie Sanders. And I don't know. Bernie Sanders is also leading in California. I could actually see Bernie Sanders being the nominee. I'm a little worried about his age. I'm a little worried about democratic socialism as a label, which I have discussed ad nauseum about how democratic socialism isn't really socialism to the extent that the dictionary definition of socialism is government or group ownership of the means of production, which democratic socialism he's talking about is more about redistribution of wealth and a strong social safety net, and that's not really socialism. But I'm digressing, of course, and I thought that, like I said, that was the longest, best news summary from NBC News' Meet the Press. And I thought it had some good coverage of the protests in Iran after, well, I'll talk about that a little more after I show the CNN State of the Union news summary, where they also show those protests. Jake Tapper, as usual, talks about what is our State of the Union this week, and we're busy because, of course, there's the impeachment trial, there's the CNN debate coming up before Iowa, and then the whole questions on Iran, the 4 embassy scandal, and the protests. The 4 embassy scandal that I said I'd be talking about later, whether there was this intelligence justifying the killing of Qassem Soleimani based on this threat to up to 4 embassies. You know, Trump always has this way of inflating and exaggerating numbers. There's 1 embassy, 4 embassies. By the election, it's going to be Qassem Soleimani was threatening up to 25 embassies, I've heard, or, well, I don't know. But anyway, here's the CNN news summary that I'll talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
Hello, I'm Jake Tapper in Washington, where the state of our union is busy. The U.S. Senate is preparing to move forward with the president's impeachment trial. 2020 Democrats are gearing up for the very last debate before Iowa voters make their choice on February 3rd. But this morning, the White House is mired in the fallout from the U.S. strike that killed Iran's top general, while the two nations appear to have pulled back from the brink of war. Here in the U.S., questions about the rationale for the strike on General Qassem Soleimani are only growing. President Trump now says Soleimani had been preparing to target 4 U.S. embassies, including the one in Baghdad. That is a threat several lawmakers said they were not told about in a briefing by top Trump administration officials. And it comes amid persistent questions about just how imminent the threat from Soleimani was. Iran is facing a different kind of fallout. Protesters risked their very lives and took to the streets in Iran to protest the regime lying to them about shooting down a passenger plane and much more. Stunningly, they are chanting death to the supreme leader there. The president tweeted in Farsi his support to the, quote, brave, long-suffering people of Iran, and this morning is warning Iran's leader, quote, do not kill your protesters. Joining me now to discuss all of this is Defense Secretary Mark Esper. Secretary Esper, thanks.
And like I said, I will have 3 Mark Esper clips. Jake Tapper will be the middle of the 3. I'll have 2 Mark Esper clips. Am I looking at, that's right, I have 1 Robert O'Brien, the Trump National Security Advisor, and then 2 Mark Esper clips, all trying to back up what Trump said about this threat on the 4 embassies, which, like I said, could end up being some continually exaggerated number. I think Jake Tapper does a better job than Chuck Todd cross-examining Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor. But you'll see Margaret Brennan actually gets Mark Esper to say, no, there was no specific intelligence that backs up this 4 embassies claim. And that will be coming up. I'm talking about clips 5, 6, and 7. But I'm about to show you clip 4, the final news summary. This is the Fox News news summary, which is always tilted somewhat in Trump's favor. Even Chris Wallace, in his introduction, when he talks about this claim about the strike on Qassem Soleimani being justified by this threat against 4 embassies, he summarizes it, and you'll see there's like a PowerPoint or whatever, a graphic behind him talking that summarizes what he's saying, and they put that up there. Threat to 4 embassies, Trump, threat to 4 embassies. At least they have the Trump : up there, so you know it's a claim by our pathologically lying president. But I think also they go to Kevin Corke, and I think he definitely centers Trump as the master of this situation. You'll see how even I'm sorry, I'm looking at my notes here. Even when Kevin Corke talks about the Iran protests, he talks about how they're also being manipulated or influenced by someone on the other side of the world, our great President Trump, who's tweeting in favor of the Iranian protests. But I do think that Trump, it's hard to say that he's lucky, because 180 people were killed in this airliner downing by the Iranian military accidentally, apparently. But in some ways, it's helped resolve a lot of the problems he caused by assassinating this Iranian general in Iraq. You can't really attribute the feelings of the Iranian people to any particular protest, but at least the people protesting the streets are now protesting the supreme leader, and even saying, death to the supreme leader, because the Iranian government shot down this airliner and then lied about it for 3 days, and that is just a almost random accident that Trump and his policy is benefiting from. You can't, like I said, you can't really call it lucky because we're talking about the death of 180 innocent people, but it seems to be benefiting Trump's or helping counteract some of Trump's bad policy choices through no real effort of his, or I don't know. I don't know exactly how to analyze that situation, but I do want to show you this Fox News Sunday news summary before I get to the newsmakers. I think I've gone off on my analysis long enough there, so I will talk a little more about this Fox News Sunday news summary after you watch Chris Wallace and Kevin Corke do, I don't know if you would call it a press release by the White House press office, but a lot of the times it seems very similar to that, which I will discuss with you after we watch it together over here.
And hello again from Fox News in Washington. The fallout from President Trump's showdown with Iran continues to be felt across the Middle East. Thousands of Iranians protest as Tehran now admits shooting down that Ukraine airliner. The president tells Fox News the top Iranian general he killed was planning attacks against 4 U.S. embassies. And Senate Democrats push for a vote to limit the president's military powers while also preparing to deal with the articles of impeachment the House will send over this week. In a moment, we'll discuss the U.S. face-off with Iran with National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. But first, let's bring in Kevin Corke with the latest from the White House. Kevin.
Chris, calls for change echoing across Tehran once again this weekend. Those demands, however, garnered the attention of a rather prominent observer half a world away. Protests swept across the Iranian capital over the weekend in response to the downing of the Ukrainian airliner that killed everyone on board, including many Iranian university students who'd been studying abroad. Some of the protesters even calling for the supreme leader to resign. After days of denial, Tehran acknowledged it launched the missile strike, calling it a mistake, but later claimed without evidence that the aircraft had turned toward a sensitive military site. The angry demonstrations were in sharp contrast to the days of mourning following the death of Iranian General Qassem Soleimani, who the president accused of plotting attacks on several U.S. embassies, justifying his removal from the battlefield. The president took his concerns directly to the Iranian people, tweeting in Farsi and in English that the government of Iran must allow human rights groups to monitor and report facts from the ground, adding that there cannot be another massacre of peaceful protesters nor an internet shutdown. The world is watching. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the Senate is watching and waiting for Speaker Nancy Pelosi to transmit articles of impeachment. If she does so on Tuesday or Wednesday, as many expect, a Senate trial could begin soon. But first, the California Democrat is expected to select 4 to 10 members of the House to manage the trial. Sources tell Fox News the Speaker will likely make her selection from a diverse group of House members. Among them, the Intel Committee Chair Adam Schiff of California. He, of course, Chris, ran the Trump-Ukraine investigation.
Kevin Corke reporting from the White House. Kevin, thank you. And joining us now.
And you see Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor for Donald Trump, was on Fox News Sunday. I'm not going to show that clip, although the next clip I'm going to show is actually Robert O'Brien on Meet the Press. But one other, I pretty much pre-criticized that Fox News Sunday news summary before I showed it in terms of it being fairly similar to what you might get from the White House press office. But one thing I forgot to say is that Kevin Corke in his news summary, I think he juxtaposed the Iran news with the impeachment news in such a way to maximize the effect of impeachment being an attack on the commander-in-chief, just like the jarring contrast between Trump acting as commander-in-chief and all the machinations of impeachment. I don't know, that's my analysis that adds to the Fox News bias. I think you can find Fox News I don't even make Fox News bias videos anymore. From most of the news you see on Fox News, it's so heavily influenced by support of Trump. Although there have been some dissenting voices in terms of Iran, Tucker Carlson and Geraldo Rivera talking about avoiding war in Iran, and that will be kind of echoed by a couple clips on the show later of Rand Paul and Mike Lee, who represent, some would say, the isolationist wing of the Republican Party, or I think they like to call themselves non-interventionist. But that's the only like saving grace of that whole Fox News summary, I think. But other than that, I think that there was bias. You can let me know what you think, especially comparing it to the two previous news summaries. But now I want to get to the newsmaker clips, starting with 3 representatives of the administration trying to back up this claim that Trump made on Fox News, talking to Laura Ingraham, that you saw in the news summaries, where he said that he believes 4 embassies, and believe becomes a very important word as you watch these next 3 clips, because it's all about belief. It's not about evidence. It's not about specific intelligence that backs up an imminent threat. And actually, I think each of these anchors from the corporate news media, they do a better and better jobs getting the representatives of the Trump administration to admit that there isn't really any specific intelligence behind this possibly made-up claim from Donald Trump that, up to 4 embassies, maybe it'll be, 10, 12, 25 embassies that were under threat from Qassem Soleimani by the time Trump gets done with it. But anyway, I think actually Chuck Todd did the worst job of the 3 clips. Like I said, it goes from worst to best. Chuck Todd, then Jake Tapper, and then Margaret Brennan actually does the best job with Mark Esper. But here's Robert O'Brien talking to Chuck Todd about the evidence over here.
Let me start with the imminent threat situation, because no one in the administration had talked about specific embassies at all. It was a very vague explanations that we got from various officials, whether it was yourself, Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Esper. But here's what the president said on Friday evening. I want to play it and get some information on the other side. Here it is.
I believe it would have been 4 embassies, and I think that probably Baghdad already started. Baghdad certainly would have been the lead, but I think it would have been 4 embassies. Could have been military bases, could have been a lot of other things too.
4 embassies. If they were targeting 4 embassies, did you guys see that as a declaration of war by Iran? I mean, that's a big thing. What 4 embassies are we talking about here?
So we were very concerned about the situation. We had exquisite intelligence, and the intelligence showed that they were looking at U.S. facilities throughout the region, and that they wanted to inflict casualties on American soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, as well as diplomats. The threat was imminent. I saw the intelligence. There's been a lot of discussion of the intelligence, and I know everyone would like to see it. I'd love to have the intelligence out there now. Unfortunately, if we declassified it, we could end up losing that stream of intelligence that will allow us to protect Americans going forward, and so we can't. But the president's interpretation of that intelligence is very consistent with it, and so look, I think this has been a Washington thing. I think when we tell the American people that there was exquisite intelligence and there was going to be an attack on Americans, we had to stop that.
But let me get you to respond to this. This is what the Washington Post is reporting. The embassy in Baghdad did not receive an alert commensurate to the threat that President Trump described, said a person familiar with the situation who was not authorized to comment publicly. When the U.S. government has specific information about threats to embassies, warnings, or alerts, they are often sent to embassy personnel to be vigilant. Apparently nobody in Baghdad was told of this. Why was that?
Well, this is a very fast-moving situation, and Soleimani was traveling around the region plotting against the United States. As soon as it looked like there was going to be some sort of action against the U.S. Embassy, the president was decisive and bold in his action. We moved a Marine company in immediately. We moved an Army infantry platoon in immediately, and we made it clear. We put Apache helicopters in the air. Right. We made it very clear this was not going to be terror in 1979. This was not going to be Benghazi.
But that was for 1 embassy. What did you do for the other 3 embassies?
I'm not. Look, we took measures with respect to other embassies in the region. I'm not going to get into the details of those and give our playbook out to the other side. But we were very concerned about embassies throughout the region.
Well, why is it that there was no specific? I mean, there seems to be a disconnect here. That this is. I mean, is it the definition of imminent?
Yeah.
I mean, do you guys see is imminent months, not weeks? Are people misinterpreting that word?
Yeah, I think imminent generally means soon, quickly, in process.
Okay.
So I think those threats were imminent, and I don't want to get into the definition further than that, but we took the measures necessary to protect American diplomats and our soldiers, sailors, and Marines. And I think what you see, because of the prompt action that we took, both with respect to the embassy in Baghdad, which they would have attempted to overrun and storm, and with respect to our military bases that were hit by the Iranians with their ballistic missiles, there was no loss of American life in either case. And I think that's a credit to the President of the United States.
Why?
So, Chuck Todd there did not really get Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor, to admit that there was no specific intelligence behind this claim from President Trump on Fox News recently that I believe 4 embassies were under attack. And the word believe is, he used the word believe there. He mentioned the word believe, and then he also used the word exquisite. You'll see Mark Esper in the next 2 clips. He says the intelligence is exquisite intelligence. And, I even looked up the word exquisite, and it like barely applied. I mean, beautiful, intricate, having deep understanding. That's another meaning of the word exquisite if you look it up in Merriam-Webster's. And that's the dishonest part, because they don't really have exquisite understanding of the threat. And you'll see eventually that we have Mark Esper admit that by the clip after next. He almost admits it in this next clip where Jake Tapper is very dogged. This is actually, I don't know if it's the best clip of the night, but it's the longest clip of the night. It's almost 5 minutes long. Jake Tapper trying really hard to get Mark Esper to admit, but you'll see Margaret Brennan. I don't know what order these interviews are in, but Mark Esper almost admits to Jake Tapper that the there's a cat right next to my camera. I hope that Dash does not affect my camera here in any way, because he's right there behind the camera. Just jumped up on the table, but I'll deal with it while I show you Jake Tapper doggedly, no offense to Dash the cat, but doggedly trying to get Mark Esper to admit there's no specific intelligence behind this 4 embassy threat, and not really getting him to admit it. But he just says, Trump believes it, I believe it, we all believe it. Of course, belief is not the same thing as evidence, which I'll talk about with you a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
As always.
Yeah, thanks, Jake.
So let's start with President Trump said on Friday the Iranians were plotting to target 4 U.S. embassies, including the one in Baghdad. Other administration officials say the intelligence was not that specific. Was there specific intelligence that the Iranians were plotting to attack 4 U.S. embassies?
Well, let me say one thing up front first to your viewers, to the American people. The United States is safer today than we were just a few short weeks ago. Why? Because we eliminated the world's foremost terrorist, Qassem Soleimani, who had the blood of hundreds of American service members on his hands. Secondly, we restored deterrence with Iran, and we did so without American casualties. And third, we reassured our friends and allies in the region that the United States will stand up and defend our interests. And I want to thank all of our brave service members who are deployed for what they did, for their brilliance in executing this very important mission.
Okay, what about the intelligence? Was there specific intelligence the Iranians were plotting to target 4 U.S. embassies?
There was intelligence that there was an intent to target the U.S. embassy in Baghdad. What the president said with regard to the 4 embassies is what I believe as well. He said he believed that they could have been targeting the embassies in the region. I believe that, as well as did other national security team members. That is why I deployed thousands of additional paratroopers to the region to reinforce our embassy in Baghdad and to reinforce other locations throughout the region.
Well, Soleimani was a horrible guy, and he killed a lot of innocent people, and he killed a lot of U.S. soldiers. There's no question about any of that.
20-plus years.
But the question is not whether he posed a threat in an existential way, because he did. He'd been doing it for years. Mm-hmm. But was there specific intelligence that he was plotting to attack 4 U.S. embassies? Did you see any intelligence like that?
I'm not going to discuss intelligence matters here on the show. Let me just say this.
The president did, though.
It's the president's prerogative. But what the president said was he believed. He said he could have been targeting. All those things that I believe as well, that the national security team believes as well. The important thing is this. Soleimani orchestrated, resourced, directed the attacks escalating up to the December one that killed an American. He orchestrated the siege on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, and he was planning this much broader plot in multiple countries that would be bigger in scale and that likely would have taken us to open hostility with Iran. In fact, a very, very senior intelligence community official said to us that the risk of inaction is greater than the risk of action. To me, that is very compelling.
Well, the president has discussed publicly that he believed, and a belief is not the same thing as there was evidence. I mean, you could believe that Soleimani would have attacked the Eiffel Tower. That's not necessarily based in evidence. I mean, he could have been.
Well, there was evidence. There was evidence that part of the attack would be against the United States Embassy
in Baghdad.
In Baghdad.
But what about the 4 embassies?
I'm not going to discuss intelligence. What the president said was he believed it probably could have been. He didn't cite intelligence.
He said it was his belief, but I mean, I guess the important matter here is, look, no one is disputing that Soleimani posed an existential threat to innocent people, but the president came out and said that he believed there was a threat to 4 embassies. Were those 4 embassies alerted that there was a threat to them?
All the embassies were alerted. That's why I deployed additional troops to the region. And let me say this much, Jake. I'm glad we're having this discussion today because I'd rather be here discussing this topic with you than going up to Dover Air Force Base and standing there while flag-draped coffins come home, and I have to explain to husbands and wives, sons and daughters, why their service member died when I had information that could have prevented that from happening.
But I guess the point is, what information?
We had information that he was orchestrating an attack.
But you're orchestrating something, but you don't know what it was.
Orchestrating an attack, likely which would include an attack on the United States Embassy.
In Baghdad.
In Baghdad. It was going to occur.
But did the Baghdad Embassy know that there was a threat to them?
Absolutely, because of course they were already under siege by Soleimani.
But a new threat, I mean, a different threat.
The embassy was constantly watching the attacks, the threat streams coming at them. Our commanders on the ground, I deployed hundreds of additional soldiers. We had Apache helicopters in the air to deter attacks and prepare to defend. We had armed drones in the air to do that. Our goal is to protect the American people.
Sure, but many members of Congress from both parties have said that none of the briefings mentioned threats to 4 U.S. embassies. Why is President Trump telling this to Fox News, but the administration is not briefing Congress on this threat of 4 embassies, unless there was actually no specific intelligence that there was a threat to 4 embassies?
The president never said there was specific intelligence to 4 different embassies.
He said he believed it.
And I believed it too.
4 embassies? You believe that?
I believe there were threats to multiple embassies. That's why we reinforced embassies with additional troops.
Well, here's the thing. Here's why it matters.
Oh, and why it matters is because if you can see the entire interview at a link down in the video description to CNN's State of the Union, where Jake Tapper will talk about a tweet from Justin Amash about how our allies and our adversaries, I think, I may be not completely remembering, but how the inability to believe the president hurts us in times of crisis, which just one of the many, many downsides of having a pathological liar as president, Donald Trump. Pathological liar, that's actually something Bernie Sanders has been saying about Trump for a long time, and I happen to agree with Bernie Sanders on that and many other things, which I'll possibly talk about a little bit later. But oh, and by the way, those of you worrying about Dash the cat being behind the camera, he did jump down, and I had a Dash and Sandy clip I was going to show you, or as some people like to call it, the Dandy clip. But I just recorded one during that last clip while we were watching Mark Esper together. I recorded Dash walking by sleeping Sandy. Sandy's, of course, sleeping right there, as she does during almost all my live streams. And so I did record a clip of Dash walking by a sleeping Sandy that I will show you after all the news clips. But I have one more Mark Esper clip. I did like Jake Tapper, like I said, doggedly going after Mark Esper on the specific evidence, but he was not successful getting Mark Esper to admit that there was no specific evidence behind this whole 4 embassy threat thing that Trump claimed. He did ask that great question about, well, why is he telling Laura Ingraham on Fox News but not telling Congress? Which is also something Margaret Brennan asked, not in the clip I'm about to show you, after the clip of her interview with Mark Esper, but she actually got Mark Esper to admit he didn't see any specific evidence of this 4-embassy threat in this 2-minute clip, which I guess is probably the Margaret Brennan gets clip of the week for getting Mark Esper to admit that basically his boss is full of shit. That he is just making stuff up, or he's just believing things because he wants to believe them and not because of actual specific evidence. But I will talk about that a little more after we watch that second Mark Esper clip together over here.
Siege of the United States Embassy there.
I want to ask you about that attempt to breach the perimeter and the embassy, but also broadly the threat that the U.S. was tracking that has been described as imminent time and again by the administration. The president said last week that there was an attempt to blow up the U.S. embassy in Baghdad. Here's specifically what he said on Fox News.
I can reveal that I believe it would have been 4 embassies, but Baghdad certainly would have been the lead. But I think it would have been 4 embassies, could have been military bases, could have been a lot of other things too. But it was imminent, and then all of a sudden, he was gone.
Why couldn't you share that specific threat with senators in a classified briefing?
Well, that information, there was a reference in this exquisite intelligence to an attack on the United States Embassy in Baghdad. That information was shared with the Gang of 8. All that exceptional intelligence shared with the Gang of 8, not the broader membership of the Congress.
A specific threat against the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad to blow it up was shared with the Gang of 8?
I was not in that meeting with the Gang of 8, but I will tell you, I spoke to one of the briefers. What the briefer said to me coming out of that meeting was his assessment that most, if not all, the members thought that the intelligence was persuasive and that the Gang of 8 did not think that it should be released to the broader members of Congress.
But broadly, can you clarify, though, was the specific threat that the president shared with Fox News about 4 U.S. embassies being under threat also shared with Congress? Why was there a difference?
What the president said was he believed that it probably and could have been attacks against additional embassies. I shared that view. I know other members of the national security team shared that view. That's why I deployed thousands of American paratroopers to the Middle East to reinforce our embassy in Baghdad and other sites throughout the region.
Probably and could have been. That sounds more like an assessment than a specific, tangible threat with a decisive piece of intelligence.
Well, the president didn't say it was a tangible, he didn't cite a specific piece of evidence. What he said is he believed.
Are you saying there wasn't one?
I didn't see one with regard to 4 embassies. What I'm saying is I share the president's view that probably my expectation was they were going to go after our embassies. The embassies are the most prominent display of American presence in a country.
The description had been that this was imminent.
So, like I said, kudos to Margaret Brennan for actually getting Secretary of Defense Mark Esper to admit that he didn't see the specific evidence of the 4 embassy threat that Trump was talking about in that Fox News clip. That is the last of the Trump administration officials I want to show you, but you saw at the beginning of that Mark Esper clip that he claimed the Gang of 8, which is the speaker of the top 4 leaders and top 4 intelligence committee leaders in the House and the Senate, are supposed to get briefed about the most sensitive intelligence behind military actions. And he said, oh, well, the Gang of 8 were briefed. Well, Adam Schiff is the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, and he was also on CBS's Face the Nation talking to Margaret Brennan, and she specifically asked him, you heard Mark Esper in that last clip saying the Gang of 8 was briefed. Were you briefed? And he said, it's not just misunderstanding. What he said was wrong. And then he starts using the word fudging, which Margaret Brennan, again to her credit, she clarifies when he says fudging, he means lying, that Mark Esper is lying, Mike Pompeo is lying, Donald Trump is lying about all of this intelligence justification for the imminent threat, which I will talk about with you a little more after we watch that Adam Schiff clip together over here.
You are part of the Gang of Eight, so you're part of that group that received the very classified briefing that the defense secretary was referring to. He said the intelligence was exquisite and it was incredibly detailed. Do you quibble with his characterization of what you were told?
I don't quibble with it. I think it's just plain wrong. There was no discussion in the Gang of Eight briefings that these are the 4 embassies that are being targeted, and we have exquisite intelligence that shows these are the specific targets.
What about U.S. Embassy Baghdad? He said that was specifically
Well,
referenced.
I don't recall, frankly, in that briefing there being a specific discussion about bombing the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. The briefing was much more along the lines, frankly, of something that Secretary Pompeo admitted the other day when he said that we don't know precisely where and we don't know precisely when. That was much more the nature of the briefing that we got. In the view of the briefers, there was plotting, there was an effort to escalate being planned, but they didn't have specificity. And so when you hear the president out there on Fox, he is fudging the intelligence. And when you hear the secretary say, well, that wasn't what the intelligence said, but that's my personal belief, he is fudging. When Secretary Pompeo was on your show last week and made the claim that the intelligence analysis was that taking Soleimani out would improve our security and leaving him in would make us less safe, that is also fudging. That's not an intelligence conclusion. That is Pompeo's personal opinion.
Is that a polite way of saying they're lying?
Well, you know, you can certainly put it that way, but frankly, I think what they are doing is they are overstating and exaggerating what the intelligence shows. And when you're talking about justifying acts that might bring us into warfare with Iran, that's a dangerous thing to do.
But to be fair, because you are the intel community,
overstating and exaggerating, that's what I was talking about earlier in terms of how Trump, whenever you hear Trump say a number, you should, you know, hold your wallet, because he will, if you watch him over time, he just keeps expanding the number. If it's, you know, how many jobs he saved, how much money he saved, how much money he's spending, how much wall he's building, it doesn't matter what the subject is. It, you know, the number just gets bigger and bigger. Just everything about Trump's claim. He's just a salesman, a dishonest used car salesman, or I don't know, just he's like the worst. If you know, over my shoulder here, you can see my Star Trek mug over here. It's a little bit in shadow, but my longtime viewers know I'm a Star Trek fan. Well, if you watched Star Trek and especially Deep Space Nine, you know, like the Ferengi rules of acquisition, the whole like Ferengi ethos, that's the Trump ethos. It's just like profit, selfishness, it all about Trump, and that's what the Trump presidency is all about, I guess. But one of the things that Trump is facing because of his interventionism with the strike on Qassem Soleimani is a split in the Republican Party, because Trump campaigned as a isolationist, non-interventionist, a Republican willing to say that the Iraq War was a mistake, that we should get our troops out of the Middle East. And the next two clips I want to show you are Republicans who are saying things that actually seem to make a lot of sense. These are two, some people say isolationist, some people say non-interventionist Republicans. The first one is, it's Mike Lee and Rand Paul. Mike Lee is a Republican from Utah, and you'll see Jake Tapper here on CNN State of the Union mention that he's signing on to a war powers resolution from Bernie Sanders, and he has serious concerns about Trump overstepping his authority. And you'll see I've edited 2 clips of the interview together here to highlight this, whether you want to call it isolationist or non-interventionist strain of republicanism. And I will talk about that a little more after we watch that clip from CNN's State of the Union together over here.
State of the Union, I'm Jake Tapper. Senator Bernie Sanders has a new ally in Congress this week, Republican Senator Mike Lee of Utah. The 2 senators are trying to block Pentagon funding for the use of military force against Iran. This comes after Lee's sharp criticism of top Trump administration officials this week, who gave what Lee called the worst military briefing he has experienced in his 9 years in Congress. Utah Republican Senator Mike Lee joins us now. He's the author of a new book. It's called Our Lost Declaration, America's Fight Against Tyranny. Senator Lee, thanks so much for joining us. So you seemed, after the briefing, very offended by the lack of information given to you. Was the administration basically just saying, hey, come on, trust us?
Look, Jake, in that briefing, we didn't receive very much information that wasn't already available through public media sources. This is one of the things that's very frustrating. When something like this happens, when events are unfolding quickly, events that will have a profound impact on national security and military strategy, Congress does need to know about it, in part so we can evaluate the scope of our authority to act or choose not to act. We didn't get that, and that was disappointing.
Did, in the briefing you experienced, did they say anything about 4 U.S. embassies were going to be targeted by Soleimani and his forces, as President Trump said he believed on Friday?
I didn't hear anything about that, and several of my colleagues have said the same. So that was news to me. It certainly wasn't something that I recall being raised in the classified briefing.
Secretary of State Pompeo said at the White House on Friday that he did tell members of Congress about the threat to U.S. embassies, as the president revealed publicly at his campaign rally when he said at least 1 embassy was going to be threatened. Take a listen to Secretary Pompeo on Friday.
All of the intelligence that we've briefed that you've heard today, I assure you, in an unclassified setting, we provide in the classified setting as well.
So that's not true?
Well, look, I'm not sure exactly what he's trying to say there. I don't recall being told, look, there were 4 embassies. I'm sure there was a mention of at least 1 embassy in that briefing, because there had been an attack on one of our embassies in the days leading up to General Soleimani's killing. But look, Jake, I want to make very clear. I issued a statement within a few hours of the attack on General Soleimani, announcing that this was a good development from the standpoint of the security of the American people. We are, in fact, safer as a result of the fact that he's dead. If you see a wounded veteran anywhere in America and they're missing a limb or they're badly disfigured, odds are pretty good that that veteran may have been wounded by an IED that was developed and deployed under General Soleimani's leadership and at his direction. And so this development is good for the security of the American people. But it does matter that we give the details to members of Congress, and it does matter to figure out where we go from here and to make sure that any further action is authorized by Congress.
So listen, you and I agree. Soleimani had the blood of innocence on his hands and was a bad person. The question is whether or not the intelligence behind his attack was what it is being presented as. And do you have any concerns? I mean, we've heard mixed messages and conflicting stories about the reason for the attack, whether it's the existential threat that Soleimani posed versus an imminent attacks versus an attack on 1 embassy versus an attack on 4 embassies. You know, you and I have sat through this movie before, conflicting, changing information, intelligence juiced in order to justify certain actions. How worried are you about the integrity of the information we're being told?
Well, I'm worried, and as a United States Senator and as a voter and citizen, I've learned not to simply take the federal government's word at face value. I mean, look, we were lied to about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We were lied to for a couple of decades about what was happening in Afghanistan. We've been lied to about a lot of things. It's not to say that the government is always lying or that the people who run it are inherently evil. It's just that they're human, and these things do happen. And so that's important to ask these questions,
to make sure that we know the details. And insofar as we're dealing with the inherent tension between the Article 2 Commander-in-Chief power enjoyed by the President and the Article 1, Section 8 Declaration of War power, on the other hand, controlled by Congress, members of Congress do need to be apprised of the information underlying a particular decision.
All right, Senator Mike Lee of Utah, thank you so much for your time, sir.
So I'm really appreciative of hearing a Republican Senator Mike Lee say things like, we were lied to about WMDs in Iraq back in 2002, 2003 by George W. Bush that got us into a war in Iraq. And we were lied to about Afghanistan. That was the, Afghanistan papers came out in this Washington Post report recently that was multiple administrations lied about the Afghanistan war being winnable. Basically, once George W. Bush messed up Tora Bora and didn't get Osama bin Laden in the Tora Bora offensive or whatever, that was the point of diminishing returns on Afghanistan. And ever since then, how many years ago? That's like more than 15 years ago. It's all been like wasted effort, and they've all been lying to us about the Afghanistan war. And to see a Republican say that, that's, I'm glad to hear that, but Mike Lee is not like a champion of the kind of foreign policy I'd like to see. And I did want to highlight his comments there, and I'm glad Jake Tapper got those comments out of him. But the last clip on this topic, before I get to a couple clips on impeachment that I want to show you, is Rand Paul. In some ways, he's very close to Mike Lee of Utah in terms of being a isolationist / non-interventionist, and he makes this point about the weird, like, bipolar nature of Trump's foreign policy, where Trump says he's non-interventionist, but all of his advisors, like Mike Pompeo and John Bolton and Lindsey Graham, they're all like hawks on Iran. What is that all about? And you'll see Rand Paul kind of explains what that's all about in the last clip on the Iran topic, before I get to a couple impeachment clips at the end over here.
It's home. It's interesting. You have, and I think in some ways, you believe President Trump's instincts comport with your instincts when it comes to national security and foreign policy. But his advisors are in a different place. How much do you think that, does that bother you, or is that healthy?
I'll give you an example. I'm on the Foreign Relations Committee, and all of his nominees come before me, and I even warned some of them in private. I'm going to ask you, do you agree with President Trump that the Iraq war was a mistake? You know what? Most of them don't agree with him. He keeps appointing people to represent him that think the Iraq war was just great. They love Dick Cheney's position, and they still don't admit that it was a mistake. So that's why he keeps getting policy that isn't his policy. But I do think his instincts are pure. He's been saying it since 20, 30 years. He's been saying for a long time that the wars have drained our treasury and that he's not in favor of these wars. But then they convince him if we leave, we'll look weak. I actually think this is a time of strength right now. Soleimani's dead. The leader of a lot of the mayhem is dead. This would be the time to come home. The Iraqi government, the democratically elected government, wants us to come home. We should come home.
I was just going to say, you think the president should take him up on this offer? You want us out? Let's do it.
Absolutely. And the only way people become stronger is when they stand up for them.
Well, that was at least one interesting thought from Rand Paul. I think I was reading the live comments from my live viewers along the way. was it GWolf333 says R. Paul is right twice a year, even if he doesn't mean to be. Is that like a play on a stop clock is right twice a day, back when clocks were not digital but had like hands that went around, and so twice a day and for a 12-hour clock would be right. Or I don't think I really have to explain that, but I was reading those live comments along the way, and I think that was an interesting commentary from Rand Paul. Right as a stop clock is twice a day, that Trump says he's non-interventionist or isolationist or whatever you want to call it, but then he keeps bringing on all these advisors who are neocons who think the Iraq War was a great idea, unlike Rand Paul and apparently Mike Lee of Utah. So that's the split in the Republican Party on this whole Iran intervention war that's not a war, that who knows what's going to happen on that, but it looks like that story may be waning. We can only hope. I mean, I can't even believe that Iran is not going to retaliate in some more stealthy way than that missile attack that didn't cause any casualties amongst U.S. troops or Iraqi troops or anyone at all. I assume there's going to be some other retaliation, but so far so good, as Trump said in one of his tweets this week on the whole Iran issue. Maybe that will be a continuing topic, but impeachment is certainly going to be a continuing topic, and I want to show a couple clips on that topic before I finish the show. The first one is one more Nancy Pelosi clip talking about her plans on the impeachment articles. It sounds like she's at least going to hold a vote in the House on the impeachment articles this week, and appointing managers and turning it over to the Senate. And I will talk about that a little more after we watch that final Nancy Pelosi clip from her interview with George Stephanopoulos on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos this morning over here.
Good morning and welcome to This Week. It's been packed with big news, so let's get right to our exclusive headliner, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. Madam Speaker, welcome.
Good morning.
I want to begin with impeachment. You told your colleagues on Friday to be prepared to send the impeachment articles to the Senate this week. So will it happen this week? And have you settled on House managers for the trial?
Well, what I did say is I would be consulting with my members this week on Tuesday morning at our regular caucus meeting that we would vote to send them over, and we'll determine in our meeting when we send them over. But I've always said I would send them over, so there shouldn't be any mystery to that. What we did want, though, and we think we accomplished in the past few weeks, is that we wanted the public to see the need for witnesses with firsthand knowledge of what happened, documentation, which the president has prevented from coming to the Congress as we review this.
But as you know, Leader McConnell didn't budge on witnesses at all. He's not promising.
Well, I think that he will be accountable to the American people for that. Over 70% of the American people think that the president should have those witnesses testify. So again, it's about a fair trial. They take an oath to have a fair trial, and we think that would be with witnesses and documentation. So that dynamic now the ball is in their court to either do that or pay a price for not doing it.
One of the points that Senator McConnell has made is that they're just following that he's going to follow the Clinton model, that you have a couple of weeks of presentations by each side, and then you have a vote on witnesses. It was 100-0 vote for that procedure back in 1998, 1999. So why isn't it fair now?
It isn't the same thing. There are at least 6 reasons, and I could take the whole program going on how it is different.
What's the biggest
one? The biggest one is that the witnesses were all deposed. You know, those witnesses that eventually came were all deposed. The president has not allowed the witnesses to be deposed for the House or for the Senate yet. So the evidence was there. It was just a question of bringing it more to the forefront. So that's a very major difference. You can depose the witnesses or you can't. But the fact is one of the things that I think is really important, what I think people should be very aware of, very unusually, the leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, has signed on to a resolution to dismiss the case. To dismiss the case. That, in his view, may be
But he's committed to having the presentations first now.
I'm telling you that he signed on Thursday to a resolution to dismiss the case. Dismissing is a cover-up. Dismissing is a cover-up. If they want to go that route again, the senators who are thinking now about voting for witnesses or not, they will have to be accountable for not having a fair trial.
You made the point that the president has blocked the witnesses, and that's true, but some of your...
So dismissing is a cover-up. Dismissing is a cover-up. You heard Nancy Pelosi say that multiple times. I don't know if that talking point will prevail. You'll see something similar to that in the next and final newsmaker clip I'm going to show you. But I also like the way Nancy Pelosi had her 6 reasons this is different than the Clinton impeachment trial. And Mitch McConnell, I don't think is going to make that talking point fly, because there were witnesses. I'm old enough to remember the Clinton impeachment trial, and there were witnesses. And of course, Ken Starr did his whole Starr report where he got a chance to interview all sorts of witnesses. The president testified to a grand jury. That's what got him in so much trouble. He gave his DNA. Trump has asserted this absolute immunity, which is ridiculous. Even executive privilege is not something you can assert if it's to cover up a criminal act, which of course you'll see in this next and final news clip. Chris Coons talk about the senator. Chris Coons is senator from Delaware, I'm pretty sure. Correct me down in the comment section if I'm wrong about that, but this is the final news clip. Chris Coons, a senator, talking about whether there are going to be 4 Republicans who will insist on there being witnesses and documents that so far Trump has refused to produce through this entire impeachment inquiry. He's asserted this weird absolute immunity defense, which has no basis in law whatsoever. And in this final clip, I think Chris Coons does a good job of following up on what you saw from Nancy Pelosi in that last clip, talking about how if Mitch McConnell, who signed on to dismissal is a cover-up. Well, here you'll see Chris Coons talking about no witnesses, a trial with no witnesses. That's also a cover-up. Anyway, that's the final news clip that from Chris Coons talking to Chris Wallace on Fox News Sunday this morning over here.
Pelosi will finally send the articles of impeachment over to the Senate this week. The Senate's going to begin its trial. How confident are you, if not at the beginning, at some point, that you can get 4 Republicans to come over and agree with the Democrats to call key witnesses?
Well, that's what this is all going to come down to, is Majority Leader McConnell is going to give us as much of a fair trial as 4 Republican senators demand. There's a key difference between trials and cover-ups. Trials have witnesses, cover-ups don't. President Trump might have had his reasons for being skeptical of the House process. In a Republican-controlled Senate, I can't think of any reason he wouldn't want folks like Secretary of State Pompeo or National Security Advisor John Bolton, who were in the room, who were on the email chains, who know what happened, to come to the Senate, testify, and clear his name. If he is exonerated in the Senate by a purely partisan vote, I don't think he will have been exonerated at all. And this is only the 3rd time in our nation's history that we're going to have an impeachment trial.
Do you have any commitment from senators, Republican senators, that they will vote to call witnesses?
No. At this point, there's just conversations, trying to find some reasonable bipartisan path forward to insist on a fair trial. I respect that there are Republicans who deeply want President Trump to have a fair trial. I think that's what all of us should want. But to have a trial where the critical witnesses were blocked by the president from appearing in front of the House, to have a trial where there's no sworn testimony available, is unprecedented. President Clinton, even President Nixon, directed his closest advisors and cabinet officials to cooperate. And in the Clinton impeachment trial, there was sworn testimony that they were debating about how it would be presented.
I got about a minute left.
Yeah.
President Trump says if John Bolton is subpoenaed and if John Bolton agrees to testify, he won't allow him to discuss their conversations about Ukraine. Take a look.
I would love everybody to testify, but there are things that you can't do from the standpoint of executive privilege. You have to maintain that.
Would any president allow his national security advisor to discuss the conversations they had over national security in the Oval Office?
If that national security advisor could clear his name by doing so, I think most presidents would. The executive privilege doesn't exist to allow you to cover up a crime. That's what the president's being accused of here. I think he should want the former national security advisor to testify truthfully in front of the Senate.
And if he says, if Bolton, there are a lot of ifs here. If Bolton is allowed to testify and the president invokes executive privilege, your response would be what?
You can't invoke executive privilege to cover up a crime. Bolton should testify.
Senator Coons, thank you. Thanks for coming in. We'll be watching what happens this week, both on a...
And thank you, Senator Chris Coons, for pointing out the important point of law that the assertion of executive privilege cannot be used to cover up a crime. And he said that multiple times. He also said that the lack of witnesses in a Senate trial would be akin to a cover-up. I hope that message wins. I mean, that is basically, in some ways, you heard Nancy Pelosi say, as you've heard her say for weeks and weeks now, you know, Benjamin Franklin said, you know, do we have a republic? He was asked, do we have a republic or do we have a monarchy, or what form of government do we have under our Constitution? Here's a copy of the U.S. Constitution my pocket Constitution that I always keep handy. It's actually an ACLU Constitution, though, of course, I'm just a lowly ACLU activist at some times, and all the opinions I express here are my own. But my point being that Benjamin Franklin said regarding our Constitution, we have a republic if we can keep it. Donald Trump is a threat to that republic because if this impeachment turns into a cover-up, a trial with no witnesses, that is the cover-up. And if the Democrats can win on that argument, if they can get, 60, 50, 60, 70% of Americans want witnesses and documents in the Senate impeachment trial, And if they're successful, then there's a possibility that the truth will come out on this whole Ukraine quid pro quo bribery scandal, where Trump solicited a bribe, asked for dirt to be manufactured on his political opponent Joe Biden when he was talking to the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskiy. As Trump says, read the transcript. Read the transcript. I want you to do us a favor, though. I want you to investigate this whole DNC Crowdstrike conspiracy theory that has no basis in fact. And I want you to investigate the Bidens and Burisma. That's what's in the transcript of the July 25th call. That's why Trump has been impeached. I mean, if you look down in the video description of my video, you will see many primary sources that back up the Trump impeachment. I am glad that in that first clip I showed tonight that Nancy Pelosi got into Trump's head, said he's forever impeached. He's impeached forever. It's a mark on his, it'll be in the first line of Trump's obituary. Who knows how long Trump is going to make it, given if you've been watching his speeches the last week with the sniffing, the slurring. I don't know what's going on with him physically, but he doesn't seem to be a well man in terms of his physical demeanor. He doesn't seem well in terms of his mental reasoning. I'm frightened for the Republic, I have to say. But anyway, that is the end of the program. That is the last news clip. I did want to thank my Super Chat contributors so far tonight. Here you go. Thanks, Lulu Girl and K-Tiff about the story changing over time. Yeah, if you watch the news summaries, they even cataloged how the story has changed over time in terms of the justification for the strike in Baghdad, at the Baghdad airport against Qassem Soleimani, the Iranian general. Yeah, the stories have definitely changed over time, but thanks there to my Super Chat contributors. I did promise a Dash and Sandy clip that I recorded during the program here. I think this is it. I hope this is it. Yeah, this is Sandy sleeping over there, and Sandy got up while Dash was over here behind the camera. I didn't get Dash jumping down, but here's Dash walking by Sandy earlier in the program, as I promised, over here. Oh, and Sandy just walked back, and maybe because I said Sandy, but you saw Dash walking across there, and oh, you saw the hashtag LiberalViewer bumper sticker, weatherproof vinyl. You can put it anywhere. Down in the video description, you can become a $5 a month patron on Patreon, or just give me a one-time $5 contribution on PayPal, or click that join button. Those are all your options to get this lowest level hashtag LiberalViewer sticker. At the $10 level on Patreon, it's a little different. At the join button, $10 level on PayPal, you get that sticker and this Constitution. And there's a higher level with the t-shirt. It was the impeached Trump t-shirt. I'm about to replace it with a t-shirt that has a logo similar to what's on this sticker. That will be coming up. Keep watching. I might have time to do a live stream roundup of clips from the Tuesday Democratic candidate debate on CNN. Very unlikely, but maybe it will happen. But I will definitely be back next Sunday and every Sunday for at least the rest of 2020, and until I have some reason to upload some other video, or until next Sunday, I guess I will be seeing all of you around the internet.